So we're very honored to count today with the presence of John Minihan in this third and last day of ISLA 2015. He's a very, very important character in the history of Ireland somehow, because he's been portraying the way Irish people live in Athy, no? First of all, excuse my English if I make any mistake, but well, you started photography at a very, very early age. You were 16, if I'm not wrong, and you were an apprentice in the Evening Standard in London. How did this start? Was it a casualty? Like, could you have been an apprentice in a silversmith, for example, or did you choose photography?
Well, Paula, first of all, as an Irish photographer, I was born in Dublin, but when I was about 7 or 8, my aunt and uncle reared me up. My father died before my mother had gone somewhere else, and it was kind of an interesting story in itself. But at about 8, I went to London, and at 15, I joined the Daily Mail as an office boy.
Okay.
Running around bits of paper in the days when newspaper offices were jangling of telephones and the incessant noise of tape machines. And there was something really new happening in my life. You know, I just left Ireland. This was in London, amazing. And after about 4 months working on the Daily Mail as an office boy, I got the opportunity to become an apprentice in the darkroom.
Right?
And that's really where it all started, because I had been going up and down to the darkroom. I became quite fascinated by the whole alchemy of photographs appearing before your very eyes. You know, this is really, it was really important to me. It's still important to me actually now, because photography has evolved so much. There's a whole generation of guys out there and girls who, as photographers, don't understand that alchemy of thinking, you know, looking, that, you know, nurturing what a photograph is. So that was the beginning. In film, and at this point in my life now at 69, I'm still working in film. So it was really quite special. And, you know, coming from Athy, I'd never forgotten how important Athy was to me. And so when I was in London, I continually, every year, 2 or 3 times a year, went back to Ireland to photograph the tradition that I came from, of love, life and death. That's the sort of triptych for me. And what happened to me, the kind of memories that were evoked in me as a child, and I could go back with a camera and capture those memories on film from 1962 until 1994, when it became a book in 1966. So in 1996 it became a book called Portrait of an Irish Town, Shadows from the Pale, it was called. So it was really important to have all those memories in that one book, you know. And that was the beginning for me of my photography. You know, 1962, and the journey all the way through, you know, all those decades, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
But you were very young when you developed the sense of portraying Ireland. Do you think living abroad emphasized or
Absolutely nothing to do with abroad. No, it's to do with my spirituality. Today is Sunday. Sunday for me was, as 5 or 6 years of age, going to Mass. You know, today, you know, spirituality is, you know, going to Mass. You know, when you're young, that's what really makes an impression on you. That's why people have to be, you know, really, really, to instill love and to understand, you know, going to Mass. Probably the first picture I ever saw as a 5-year-old was a picture in a mascot. Because, you know, when you understand the Irish kind of psyche about the way we ritualize death, and then you go to Mass and you see a prayer book open and it's got a mass card. And there's a rather strange, not strange, but a rather very evocative small black and white photograph of a loved one, like a thumb size, you know, muzzy black and white. Probably the first photograph I ever saw in my life was, you know, was that. And that whole solemnity of love, which is in that sort of thing. So for me, you know, 5, 10, 15, 16 apprentice, I never forgot those moments. And of course, being 16, being an apprentice, I was in a new chapter of my life when I started looking at documentarians, photojournalism, but particularly people like the work of Edward S. Curtis, who captured the North American Indians, Walker Evans, who photographed the Dust Bowl period in America. And I felt I could do something like that in Ireland, because we don't really have a visual tradition.
That's true, yeah.
So that was the beginning. So constantly I would go back to Ireland, taking pictures of the people I went, you know, who I saw on the corners as I was going to school. Looking, you know.
And it's very interesting because you have pictures of unknown people that you normally name, but you also have pictures of important names in Ireland. Like you're one of the most important photographers of Beckett, Samuel Beckett. Can you? We're talking lots about literature here. You also have pictures of Francis Bacon, Patti Smith, and O'Brien. But what's your relationship? What's your relationship between photography, literature?
Well, photography and literature, for me, has been very important, because from the time I was about 16 and started looking at the collaboration between photographers and writers, you know, the image will live much longer than the word, in a sense. Words are distilled and you change. But, and I say, you know, like as a film photographer, what you see is what you got. You can't believe that anymore, because we live in a kind of different world now of digital photography, where people, you know, change things, and you know, it's all a bit sinister, really. But I loved going back to the beginning of photography in 1839 with Louis de Gour, Nadar. I mean, we wouldn't know what Baudelaire looked like if it wasn't for Nadar, or we wouldn't know what the man who wrote that wonderful French writer who wrote Les Miserables, what was it called?
Hugo?
Victor Hugo. You know, to see a picture of Victor Hugo on his deathbed. I mean, I think it was 1869. It was quite evocative. I mean, all these, I always watched that. And then Brassai and his relationship with Henry Miller, and James Joyce, of course, you know, had a relationship photographically with Giselle Freund. And as I said, we wouldn't know what Oscar Wilde looked like, really, if it wasn't for Napoleon Cerrone, who photographed him on his first visit to America. And those photographs have been painted, sculpted. And as I said, you know, importantly, here we are at the Cervantes Center. I'm not a linguist, but a photograph doesn't need translation. That's the beauty of it. So, you know, the suffering of mankind is seeing what it's in Buenos Aires, or what is in Dublin, or wherever, you know, it's wonderful.
I was going to ask you about this, because I know you've been working lately in Buenos Aires, La Habana, and I wonder if the process of taking pictures has been different. You don't speak Spanish, do you?
Well, you know, I think I don't. I mean, I can say a few words like cerveza.
Yeah.
And that's about the size of it, really.
Yeah. So, for example, when photographing a known reality as Ireland is for you, is the process different when you can communicate with the people you're taking pictures of, as when you go to South America and you take pictures of people you can't establish a verbal connection with? Is it a different...
Not really. You know, going to Buenos Aires, I mean, the one thing that ties everybody together is morte, death. Everybody is going to lose somebody they love, and the graveyards are full. And particularly, like, for example, you were talking about Samuel Beckett. I mean, Paris is still one of my favorite cities, the city of light, which gave birth to photography. And its graveyard, they really celebrate their graveyards because of the people who live in the graveyards, you know, like Jean-Paul Sartre, of course, and the ding. Samuel Beckett's in the cemetery of Montparnasse, as indeed is Man Ray. And I go to graveyards, you know, because I kind of, you know, I'm interested in this sort of, not only the peace and tranquility, but also the captions that sometimes are on the stones. The temperament makes you think, you go around. But, and of course the same with Buenos Aires. You know, Buenos Aires in the 1920s had a very, very big Irish population there. And when you go into the Cemetery Recoleta in Buenos Aires, you can see these Irish names. And, of course, you know, through literature, Evita, Eva Perón is buried in Recoleta, and of course, for the photographer, it always makes interesting pictures, the cemetery. There's always something to be found. And then, of course, with literature in Buenos Aires, of course, Borges, you know, I mean, I was in Buenos Aires, I met Borges's widow, and she took me around the foundation, the Borges Foundation. I was able to photograph her holding a photograph of her husband, which was interesting. So I love all the, a photograph has a narrative, and you can tell a story through just the photograph,
You've made reference to the change that photography has undergone since you've started until the present moment. How about Ireland that you've portrayed? Have you seen a big change in the Ireland you started to portray?
Yeah, I mean, Ireland, for me, I get frustrated and aggravated because we don't really, the visual arts are not celebrated. I mean, when I say that, I'm talking about photography, it's not celebrated the way it should be. Of course, we have the oral tradition, and we have our great writers, but some of our great writers were photographers. Like, for example, George Bernard Shaw was an enthusiastic photographer who took thousands of photographs. All these pictures are in the London School of Economics, Down here, just a few yards up the road here, across the road, the National Gallery of Ireland has a bookshop. There's no shelf devoted to photography. And yet, as you walk into the bookshop, there's a huge statue of George Bernard Shaw, and they're thanking Shaw because Shaw left a third of his royalties to the National Gallery of Ireland. And of course, hold on a second, Shaw was a terrific photographer. He loved photography, and yet there's not one picture book in there. Not even his own book on photography is in there, So I get a little bit frustrated about that, because sometimes we'll celebrate bad art.
Yeah.
I'm a photographer, and I'm a good photographer, and I'd rather celebrate good photography than bad art. Sometimes in Ireland, we tend to celebrate, it's mediocrity. I don't have time in my life for mediocrity. It's either good, bad, or indifferent. You know what I mean? I like good photography. I like good art. I like, that's just it. And here in Ireland, we have many, many great photographers who should be much more celebrated than they are. Because sometimes we tend, as the Irish, to look towards other people because they come onto our land. And sometimes, they have the distinction because of where they may come from, when really some of our own homegrown photographers are brilliant. I'm not going to talk about them because there's a lot of them, some of them have passed on, but I'm only speaking on their behalf. So, so of course, here we celebrate the oral tradition, but George Bernard Shaw was a photographer. Another writer who is an amazing photographer is John Millington Synge, who, of course, is the author of Playboy the Western World, who photographed the Aran Islands because he wanted to see what the natives, the locals were wearing. Photograph is an aide-memoire. It tells us here and now, it's the now. This is it at a certain time,
Yeah.
And his photographs are brilliant. And of course, even Oscar Wilde dabbled a bit with photography. So, and of course James Joyce set up the first cinema here in Dublin, the first silent movie cinema. So it goes on, but anyway. But does that answer your question a bit, Paul, a little bit?
Yeah. Well, I was mainly asking not only about the situation of photography in Ireland, but Irish society. Have you seen a big change?
Yeah, I mean, there's always going to be change. This is Dublin.
And
London.
is your view as pessimistic as with photography?
No, I mean, I'd like to see photography, as I said, much more out there. So look, in the Pompidou Centre in Paris sells more postcards in black and white than they do in colour. They sell more Man Rays than Monets. People love photography, and I know that because when you go into people's homes and you look at people, you look at the mantelpiece, you might see a loved one. People are touched by reality. That's the reality.
Yeah.
It's something real, and I mean, so there are changes, but it's going to happen. And I'm out there as a kind of photographer who, thankfully, because I was able to travel, because I left Ireland when I was about 8, went to London and got this. And of course, when you work for a national newspaper,
you get
the whole world comes into the darkroom.
Yeah.
When I was in 1963, I'm touching the pictures coming over the wires from Dallas, Texas, of Jack Ruby shooting Lee Harvey Oswald. I'm part of the history of all that, developing it, because I had to make it more contrast image so that it could be wired on, because in them days it was wire machines, to regional offices in Cardiff, Edinburgh, Liverpool, you know, all this kind of thing. So that's how important it was, that whole alchemy of me understanding. And funny enough, you might even gather it. I'm as excited today by photography as I was then.
That is very interesting. And were you working on at the moment? When did you came back from South America recently? And
well, it's in December.
In December.
There was a Beckett Festival in South America. Beckett, like, you know, is a man. Funny enough, I have a friend of mine. I just saw him for coffee there a couple of days ago in Dublin. And he's an actor. And his friend, another actor, is working on the border of Iraq and Iran. And his friend sent him on. They were having something to eat in Tehran, in a coffee shop in Tehran, and the menu was my photograph of Samuel Beckett in the cafe in Farsi. Now here's Beckett, who doesn't have an enemy in the world, in Tehran, in a world today where everyone else's enemy, you know, but Beckett is there, you know, ever tried, ever fail again, fail better. Samuel Beckett in Farsi, and I'm rather proud of that. He's a photographer, you know. So yeah, December I was in Buenos Aires. And then November I was in Buenos Aires, then in December I was in Moscow doing a thing, and just photographing the underground metro system, which is really interesting in itself. You know. And then in March I had an exhibition in Charles University, Beckett and the Wake. Because, you know, you don't just photograph a man like Samuel Beckett, you offer him something. When you're talking about arguably one of the greatest dramatists in the world, you know. I mean, like, if Shakespeare is Hamlet, Beckett is Godot. I mean, Beckett is the man. And I met him through those photographs with I for 34 years. The ordinariness of an Irish town. I should meet the most extraordinary figure in literature. So, you know, when you talk about, you know, celebrated or famous people, it means nothing. Fame is a flirt. It's like a feather. It means nothing. Nothing. The ordinariness, if you can see the ordinary, then you're gifted with the extraordinary sense of being. You know what I mean? That's what makes it work. Not to traverse the same old well-trodden bullshit road. You know what I mean? It's really kind of about being spiritual, being aware, and thankfully, you know, it works. But having that spiritual element is really important. When you're 5, looking, thinking, the smell of incense wafting through your nose, you're looking at things happening, this ritualistic, it doesn't happen anymore. It's called belief. And if you have belief, you'll live forever. If you don't, well, join the gravy train, you know, just to sort of, it's nothing.
Interesting. So I think with this reflection, we have to finish this interview. Very interesting. I thank you myself, and I thank you in the name of Instituto Cervantes, and thanks for being with us today, and thanks very much for this little conversation.